You're listening to the Mushroom Revival Podcast. So what have you got for us today, Lyra?
Oh, only a report on the most iconic mushroom in the world. Any guesses?
Magic mushrooms, I'm guessing? Button mushrooms?
I'll give you a hint. It's got a red cap with little white dots.
Fly Agaric.
Yes!
AKA Amanita muscaria, the Mario mushroom, Soma, the Santa Claus mushroom, the mushroom emoji on your phone.
Yeah, all of the above.
Yeah, wow. It is one of the most iconic mushrooms in the world. You can see this mushroom on postcards, on clothing, even popularized by Super Mario. But I've always wondered, why?
It's a great question, Alex, and I've wondered this myself. But guess what? Today we have an expert by the name of Mr. Kevin Feeney who wrote a 450-page book with over 24 contributors all about this mushroom. It's called Fly Agaric, a Compendium of History, Pharmacology, Mythology, and Exploration.
So, my lovely, lovely listeners, sit back on your toadstools. Today on the show, we are going to demystify the iconic Fly Agaric mushroom. Its history, culture, ecology, and yes, psychoactive properties. We might even cover how to prepare this mushroom as an afternoon snack.
As a practicing mycologist, I'd like to say I first encountered this mushroom in the forest, but honestly, it was Super Mario.
For me, it was Mario Kart. While none of us are truly new to this mushroom, it's still a stranger in many ways. So why don't we start over with the Fly Agaric by visiting its mycology?
So this enigmatic mushroom begins as a kind of egg. The mycelium, or vegetative state of the fungus, will form a grape-sized whitish mass just above the soil. And inside, if you did a longitudinal cut, you would see a baby mushroom. And this eggshell is known as the universal veil. It's a temporary protective membrane for the young mushroom. And as it swells, the mushroom breaks through the top and emerges as the familiar cap and stem. Those little white dots, or warts, are leftover bits of that veil, and the little skirt you see just below the cap is a membrane that protects the gills until the mushroom matures and expands. And they can grow quite large, up to a foot tall, and the cap can be about the size of a dinner plate.
And underneath the soil is just as interesting. So amanitas are mycorrhizal fungi, meaning it forms a symbiotic relationship to surrounding trees, like oak, pine, cedar, and birch, just to name a few, by fusing its mycelium to the tree roots. They exchange nutrients and make each other healthier. And this is a big reason why Amanita mushrooms are so difficult to cultivate. Most mycorrhizal species are obligate symbiotes, and we just haven't been able to replicate those conditions in a lab or farm. But you can technically farm them by inoculating or burying specimens near compatible trees, much like truffles. But ultimately, we can't farm them like we do other mushrooms.
Yeah, it's got some bizarre chemistry, and luckily, Kevin knows a little bit about this. So it has an obligate symbiosis with plants or trees around it in order for it to thrive and eventually fruit. I was wondering if you have any knowledge as to if any of its pharmacology is due to its relationship with the plant. Do you know if that tree is responsible for the preliminary metabolites or anything like that?
I think that is a really interesting and potentially promising area of research. This is one of the things that's been really confusing to people, is why does the potency of the mushroom appear to vary so much? And I should qualify that by saying that it does vary, but it tends to vary within a specific range. So it's not like out of control. But it's significant enough that one dose that somebody takes one time could be, just perfect for them. The next time nothing could happen, or the time after that, it could be way overpowering. So this has been one of the points of confusion with this mushroom, and there's lots of different variabilities that can go into this. And clearly the mycorrhizal relationship of the mushroom could be one of the keys to understanding the variations in potency that's reported from these mushrooms. So I think that would be something that would be really interesting to look at. And just as an example, the honey mushroom is not a mycorrhizal mushroom. It's a parasitic mushroom, but the edibility of the mushroom depends on what it's parasitizing. So one of my thoughts is that you could have a comparable situation where with Amanita as a mycorrhizal, there's something about that relationship with a specific type of tree, whether it's a birch or an oak or a pine, that maybe makes that chemical output different than it would be with a Amanita muscaria that's paired with a different host tree. But there's not any specific research on that point that I'm aware of.
So in the mycorrhizal sense, Amanita muscaria is a promiscuous fungus and will form relationships with a variety of abundant tree species. For this reason, they are more prolific around the world and fruit quite frequently. So whether it's Amanita muscaria, a subspecies, or a sister species, they're found on all continents except Antarctica.
Which can help explain its diverse popularity. Amanita muscaria is very much a cosmopolitan mushroom. But here's a mystery. How did it become this archetypal mushroom? I mean, come on. Even virtually all mushroom emojis, be it Apple, Android, Facebook, Twitter, they all use Amanita muscaria.
Right. No, it's very strange that it certainly just kind of pops up everywhere and in very odd ways. I had people, send me photos of, at their local grocery store. They have, at the mushroom bin, they've got, a picture of the Fly Agaric mushroom, which is a little confusing.
Super.
But it is that, icon for a mushroom. And I even saw somebody use it in a Facebook discussion group the other day where somebody was asking about, how do you prepare or how do you use mushrooms? Instead of mushroom, they use the icon for Fly Agaric. And then it was kind of confusing because the person's probably talking about psilocybes, but they've used this icon that indicates that they're talking about something else. And of course, the information you're going to get is going to be very different depending on which mushroom you talk about.
Right.
I think the mushroom is fairly prolific in the northern hemisphere. It's easily identified. It's eye-catching, and I think there's something generally kind of mysterious to many cultures about kind of mushrooms in general. So I think it's one that stands out, which is not to say that there are not other just amazingly beautiful mushrooms. But this one is fairly unique, and it tends to make an impression on people when they find a fresh, robust specimen. It's pretty eye-catching for sure. So I think it stands out in that way.
And its psychoactive and poisonous properties also contribute to this popularity. Amanitas go way back. With the confines of accessible information, they show up most notably in Siberia, Scandinavia, Mexico, and India. And Siberia is the only region with solid evidence of historical use. There is substantial archaeological evidence suggesting ritual use in Mexico, and many ethnobotanists and ethnomycologists believe the sacred drink called Soma that's mentioned in the Rig Veda, the Indian Book of Hymns, was made from this mushroom. And in Scandinavia, legend has it that the Amanita muscaria may be the impetus of Western Christmas traditions, even going so far as claiming that the original ornaments hung on a Christmas tree were Amanita mushrooms being hung to dry.
So could you say it's famous because it's intoxicatingly beautiful?
Yeah, I would. If you're lucky. Because, you see, as a psychedelic, Amanitas aren't like other magic mushrooms. First of all, the compounds that make you high are completely different from the ones you find in magic psilocybin-containing mushrooms. They don't contain any psilocybin, but rather a compound called muscimol. That's the psychoactive component, but here's where things get tricky. The muscimol is a derivative of another compound found in the mushroom, ibotenic acid, which is the component that makes it poisonous and will leave you feeling pretty sick and pretty nauseous.
So you want to turn that ibotenic acid into muscimol, and that requires some extra steps. And depending on the preparation, this mushroom can be poisonous, psychoactive, or just a delicious snack with no detectable side effects. One of the most creative preparations is actually what gives this mushroom its name, the Fly Agaric. So in European regions especially, Amanita mushrooms were traditionally used as an insecticide. One would simply place little pieces of the mushroom cap in a saucer of milk to attract and drown, or possibly drug, the flies. I would actually love to know what the first person was up to when they first discovered this.
And it also turns out that musca is Latin for fly. The scientific name for housefly is Musca domestica. So Amanita muscaria, fly Amanita, Fly Agaric, there you have it.
So, were the flies being poisoned by the ibotenic acid or drugged from the muscimol and then drowning? It turns out that there are some favorable chemical reactions going on when you combine raw milk and Amanita muscaria.
So in the final piece, which is the most interesting piece, I think, that Trent and I talk about in this chapter, is that the Soma is described as being mixed with milk. And of course, at that time, we've had pasteurized milk now for the last 150 years, which allows us to mass produce milk and ship it all over the country and the world. But it also removes a lot of that kind of life-giving, healthy nutrients that milk is good for. And among those things is the lactobacillus bacteria. So when they were making Soma, they're not using pasteurized milk. They have this lactobacillus, and this creates something called a glutamate decarboxylase, which we found catalyzes the conversion of ibotenic acid into muscimol. So if Amanita muscaria is Soma, then this makes a lot of sense, because what they're doing, as described in these religious hymns, when applied to Amanita muscaria, would produce the most potent version of the mushroom that one could ingest. So I think the parallels there are amazing. I think the identity of Soma is still up for debate. I don't know that we will ever know for certain, but I am really kind of blown away at the parallels that we've seen between Soma and the Fly Agaric when looking specifically at these preparation techniques.
So the bacteria in the raw milk were able to cause the decarboxylation of ibotenic acid into muscimol, ultimately rendering a less poisonous, more psychedelic drink.
Calling all mixologists. It's happy hour somewhere. Just kidding. Don't try this at home, folks. I'd never heard about the lactobacillus, so that's awesome. One of the arguments that I would love to get your opinion on was I've heard that Amanita muscaria is never grown in India, and maybe it was traded, and maybe people brought it in, but psilocybin grows really abundantly in India and around India, and there's a lot of cows, a lot of cow dung. Cows are so sacred. That symbiosis with the cow, right, and the milk from the cow would make sense because they're honoring, okay, the mushrooms are coming from your dung. But yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts.
Right. I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting connections to be made there too, with the psilocybes and the cow dung and the milk from the cow. Part of Wasson's theory was looking at the Indo-European migration patterns. So the Vedic peoples that wrote the Rig Veda are part of these Indo-European migrations out of the Caucasus Mountains that's kind of right in the middle of Asia and Europe. And people from that region, the Caucasus, migrated in a number of different directions. But one of the groups migrated eastward, ended up down in the Indus Valley. So one of the ideas then was that this is something that they brought with them, a tradition that they had, and Soma is often referred to as growing in the mountains. So Wasson kind of speculated that, well, maybe they had to go up into certain known mountain ranges to procure the mushroom for their ceremonies. So this is all kind of part of his theory. But as far as I'm aware, there are some psychoactive amanitas that do grow in India. I would have to look into that and see what parts of India exactly they grow in. So there's a chapter in the book by Giorgio Samarini who talks about these large mushroom stones that are, they're taller than people, that are found in parts of India, and they appear to possibly be representations of the psychoactive Amanita mushrooms. And one of the things that he points out is that we seem to be culturally kind of preoccupied with the Fly Agaric as the kind of preeminent psychoactive Amanita, but it's hardly alone within the genus of Amanita. So, obviously we have Amanita pantherina, and we've got a number of different psychoactive Amanitas. So one of the things that he kind of discusses is that we don't have to restrict ourselves to the Amanita muscaria when we are investigating signs of potential psychoactive Amanita use. That when you've got representations that have the iconic features of the warts on the cap, the collar on the stem, and at the bulbous base, but you may not have any color indicators in, archaeological artifacts. You have the outline, you have these features, but you don't have the color element. So, you could still be looking at different types of psychoactive Amanita.
I didn't know that there's other types of psychoactive amanitas. Do they all contain muscimol, or are there other compounds that different species have?
Well, there are quite a number of psychoactive amanitas, and they all contain the same compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid. And they're all within kind of the section and subsection Amanita. So it's not all mushrooms in those categories, but there are quite a number that do have those compounds in them. So this does kind of extend beyond the Fly Agaric, and there are a couple dozen different species, subspecies, and varieties in North America that are psychoactive. And some of them haven't been properly described yet in terms of being a species.
There is a way to prepare this mushroom as a food. If anyone has had the great pleasure of hanging out with Larry Evans during the Telluride Mushroom Festival, you may have gotten to taste these things. One of the first Telluride Mushroom Festivals I went to, Larry actually gave me a bite raw. But I think it's way better prepared in a meal. How does one cook them to be dormant in side effects, besides satiation?
So the Amanita muscaria's food is something that is wonderful and additionally sort of bizarre aspects of this mushroom. So typically what one would do is you'd boil the mushroom for about 10 minutes, discard the water, rinse it, and boil it for another 10 minutes, and discard and rinse again. And, for people that are interested, the first recipe came from David Aurora and William Rubel, wrote an article about this a dozen years ago or so, and my understanding is that David Aurora has fixed this mushroom and served it to thousands of people. And what they use is they do about 100 grams of fresh mushroom per quart of water, and they encourage using more water than that if you can, fit it in your pot. And typically, if people follow those directions, what you're left with is, some people would expect that the mushrooms would be mushy and that their texture would just be destroyed, but it's still really kind of hearty and tender. It has a nice texture and a nice kind of mild flavor. It doesn't have any of the compounds in it that will make you inebriated or that will make you sick either. So once you've gone through that, you can fry them up, you can put them in any number of different dishes, and it's a pretty tasty mushroom. And there are some kind of recipes in the book offered for people who are, curious to explore that a little bit.
And if you were wondering, neither the mushroom nor its psychoactive compounds are scheduled on a federal level. But for real, my friends, please be safe out there and consult some advanced mycologists before you decide to ingest any Amanita mushrooms. In your book, I read about people of northwestern Russia preparing an Amanita, and they would peel off the red skin. And I'm wondering why. Does it have some sort of chemical makeup that the rest of the body doesn't have, and that's undesirable? Is that where a lot of the ibotenic acid lies?
Interestingly, with the muscaria cap, if you'd put your thumb and index finger, on the margin of the cap, you can pull on the skin or the cuticle, and you can pull that back pretty much all the way to the middle part of the cap. So some people will peel the red cuticle off the top and use that. And for a while, it was thought that that was the most potent part of the cap in the cuticle. The cuticle is actually not terribly potent. It's probably more similar to the stem in terms of potency. The potency of the mushroom does vary depending on the part of the mushroom that's being used. So the cuticle is not terribly potent, but there is usually a yellowish orange layer of flesh right beneath the cuticle, and that is the most potent part of the mushroom. So I have heard of recipes where the cuticle is used and made into a tincture, and it's used topically. Fly Agaric does have anti-inflammatory properties as well as pain-killing properties, so a lot of people find that fairly effective as a topical remedy.
Are there any myths that you want to debunk about Fly Agaric? I've heard people say the Berserker story is not entirely true. Any major red flags that you, every time you hear, you cringe up or something that is just not entirely true?
Well, there are so many different things that one could talk about. So one of the earlier questions was about the warts on the cap. People ask whether they need to scrape the warts off because maybe the warts contain strychnine or something like that. And I don't know why it's always like strychnine and the acid or strychnine and this, or it's always strychnine is the, this kind of imaginary culprit. So there's no strychnine in the warts or anything like that that would require them to be rubbed off. And it's not dangerous to touch. It's not dangerous to let your kids touch them. Obviously it's always good for people to, wash their hands before they eat food and things like that. But people don't need to worry about absorbing the toxins through their hands or things like that. It's not a deadly species. It's not dangerous to hold. And a lot of mushroomers and mycologists, one of the things that people use to identify species sometimes is to take a small piece of a mushroom, roll it around in the mouth to see what the flavor is, if it's bitter, if it's peppery, and people can usually do that pretty safely with a number of different mushrooms. So
There's a story that Vikings used to take Amanita muscaria before battle to get them hyped up and go berserker, right? And that's where the word came from, and they just went on rampages under the influence of Amanita. I've heard some people say that's all made up, and it's really not true. So I just want to get your opinion on that.
I think this is a really kind of interesting story, and a lot of people are fairly dismissive of it. And of course, we're looking at a phenomena that's about 1,200 years old, so we're not likely to get any clear answers about it. But the original hypothesis or theory was posited in the late 18th century. I think there's a lot of interesting things to look at with the berserkers. One is they have these kind of manic rages where they are seemingly invincible. They don't feel pain. They have super strength, but then they also go into these periods of torpor or deep sleep. So these different kind of behaviors suggest some sort of pharmacological agent being involved. And if we're going to limit ourselves to the part of the world where the Vikings were and what they had access to, and things that are native to their habitat, the Amanita muscaria is something that pops up there. So there are some interesting features about the muscaria. One is that it does appear to give people strength and an ability to endure things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to endure. So there are a number of stories that come out of Siberia of people, hiking 10 miles with, 100 pounds of flour or something on their back. Something that most people, wouldn't wouldn't ever do. Even still, in more recent kind of ethnographic accounts, the older generation, they continue to use the Fly Agaric when they're working. So reindeer herders, they use it because it gives them energy and it gives them strength. Women use it when they're, tanning hides and doing things like that. It allows them to do work that would otherwise feel like it was backbreaking labor, and it also makes the work more interesting. So I like to say, coffee gives me energy and it keeps me up, but it doesn't make my job any more interesting. And it also is known for putting people to sleep, and people have kind of very elaborate dreams while they're sleeping under the influence of this mushroom. So these kind of features of these manic episodes and these feats of strength that the berserkers are known for, as well as these kind of periods of sleep, are all features of Amanita muscaria inebriation. So that doesn't mean that it is the substance that the berserkers were consuming. But the parallels are there and are worthy of debate, certainly. One of the reasons I think the theory gets dismissed so frequently is that Gordon Wasson, who's really kind of the one that put this type of study and investigation into Amanita muscaria kind of on the map. But Wasson kind of dismissed the berserker theory. He didn't want the mushroom to be associated with a violent group.
Yeah.
And I can only speculate as to what his reasoning was or what he was thinking about at the time. But of course, this came out in his book Soma, came out in '68, which was leading up to the election of Richard Nixon, who then brought us the war on drugs. So, I don't know if that was something that he was thinking about, but certainly if this was a mushroom that he felt an affinity for, you could see how he maybe might feel protective about how people perceive and view it. So I don't think the berserker theory is a slam dunk, but I don't think it should be dismissed as quite as easily as a lot of people tend to dismiss it.
Amanita muscaria is a mushroom full of historical mysteries, most of which we can provide definitive evidence for, but all make for great stories nonetheless. The best we can do is be educated on what we do know, and carry the rest with a grain of salt. Choose the version you like most, and respect those who prefer a different one.
And big thank you to Kevin Feeney for all the knowledge and for writing the compendium. You can get a copy for yourself by visiting the link in our show notes. Additionally, for those of you tuning in before April 23rd, Kevin P. Feeney is going to be a part of a panel hosted by Chacruna.net for Sacred Plants in the Americas. It's a virtual psychedelic summit on the globalization of plant medicines and indigenous reciprocity.
And you can support the show and keep content like this coming by visiting our website, mushroomrevival.com, and purchasing any of our products or functional mushroom extracts for health and wellness. Podcast listeners get a special discount for 10% off. Just enter MR Podcast, all capital letters, at checkout. Again, that's MR Podcast. And if you like the show, please consider leaving a review, telling your friends, and subscribing.
It would mean the world to us. We want to keep giving you weekly reports on all things fungi, and using the coupon code helps us track our listener support and ensure that the Mushroom Revival podcast continues.
And as always, much love, and may the spores be with you.